going to open up in Philippians because that's what I've been doing with the guys. And just want to talk a little bit about that. But then I'm going to go all over the place. Did you get that thing queued up, Paul? Yeah? No? Okay. This weekend I was really struggling with what to talk to you guys about, and especially after Brian came up on Sunday and did a really good job, so I felt a lot of pressure. So I went and talked to my spiritual advisor. She's 7 years old, and she made me something. She made this little book, and on the book she had a little title, and it said, she loves certain people because they love her. And what she meant by that was that when she says, I love you, they say, I love you back, okay? And if you've heard me teach on Saturdays with the guys or when I've been up here, the Lord's been dealing with me a lot on that issue. Actually, I wrote a couple of blogs about love, and if you haven't read them, don't feel bad. They're on our website, though, if you want to read them. And so I took that, and I just kind of want to go into a little bit about love. So in Philippians, just to give you a little background, Paul is writing to a church that he loved. And if you've been here on Saturday mornings, guys, forgive me. It's going to be a little bit redundant, but he's writing to these folks that he loves. And he doesn't really rebuke them or anything like he does in some of the other church letters, like with Colossians 2 and Galatians and Corinthians. But he tells them how much he loves them over and over, and he writes about joy, and it makes me think that there's a big deal about love and about serving and about putting others ahead of yourself and all these things that we kind of gloss over. And Paul gives us these three things, actually, well, maybe more than that. Look at verses 8 and 9 in chapter 1. And forgive me, it's been a long time since I've been up here. They haven't let me up here, so if I stumble, just go with it. Laugh if you think I'm trying to be funny, because I think my kids may be watching on the stream. So, go for it. He says, "For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God." So Paul prays that they would be able to love even more, to love better than they already do. And he gives them this framework on how to do that. And I want to touch on that, but before we do, we're going to skip around. Jump to Matthew 22. Verse 34. And I want to look a little bit about what the New Testament says about this agape and just how important it was to Jesus and how important it is to him that we are good lovers. Matthew 22:34. And when Jesus is talking, he's already had a couple of confrontations with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians, and about, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Is there really a resurrection? Things like that. And basically they're trying to stump him. They're trying to get him to slip up and say something that they can accuse him with. And so in verse 34, he says, "But then the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees." So the Pharisees, they think, okay, it's our turn again. They gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, this lawyer, he has a 3-piece tunic and some wingtip sandals. And he asked him a question, testing him and saying, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment." So I imagine this lawyer, this scribe, this person, this religious leader is doing, okay, that's pretty, that's good. I expect you to say that. But then Jesus says, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So he's telling him that everything in the Old Testament is summed up in our vertical relationship with God and our horizontal relationship with one another. Turn again to Leviticus 19. Now, when he gives this response, the first part of that is basically the Shema, hear, O Israel, and he talks about loving God. The second part is from Leviticus 19, starting in verse 18. And I want to go through here and just kind of unpack a tiny little bit of what Jesus was really saying. He says in verse 18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your life... Oh, wait a second. Let me go higher. Let me go backwards. Sorry. Where am I? Go up to verse 9. Let's start over. Notes are bad. It says, verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So he's saying that we're to leave, they were to leave whatever fell down, kind of to like a welfare system, to take care of their neighbors. And he goes on and he says, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. He's given us already two examples of how to treat one another with love, to be honest, to be, not to lie, not to misrepresent ourselves, and to take care of one another. He goes on and he says, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not cheat your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Interesting, in your heart, deep down inside. Like what my spiritual advisor was saying, if you write it and you say it, it's good, right? It's good. I tell you, I love you. You tell me you love me back. We're all good, right? But it's not necessarily just what you say. It's really a heart thing, because what we have in our hearts is going to flesh itself out into our lives. And so he goes on and he says, verse 18, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. He talks about loving God with our whole being. When he says that we're to love God with our heart, soul, with our mind. Imagine that, even your mind. How do you love God with your mind? You meditate, right? David said to meditate on the word, all day, all night. But I think it's more than that. We live in this culture that is very anti-Christian, right? I used to say that about 3-4 years ago, and people would look at me like I was some weirdo. But it's coming about now. We live in this culture that is very against us, trying to marginalize, the biblical worldview. And I think it behooves us to learn to think biblically, to have a biblical worldview. And I think the main goal of that, or the main objective, is found here. If we love God, and we really love God, we want to spend time with him, we want to please him, we want to obey him, and if that works out into us loving our neighbors, then we're going to actually have a pretty strong weapon in regards to the culture, because that's going to make an impact. So right here, we start with looking at love, and we see the power of love, and we see that, we're to love God with everything. When you look at this and it says that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, some people will try to say, see, you got to love yourself. How are you going to love your neighbor if you don't even know how to love yourself? Okay? That's not biblical. Paul says that we're not, in the end times, men would be lovers of themselves. It's not something we're supposed to be having to strive at, because you know what? We already love ourselves too much. So when we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, we love them maybe the way we love ourselves, or maybe as an extension of ourselves, because we're all connected. We're all created in the image of God. Turn to Matthew 5:43. In Matthew 5:43, it says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Okay? "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." Now this is from the Sermon on the Mount. Some people would identify back in that time, your neighbor was basically anybody in the Jewish community, okay? So somebody outside of the Jewish community, a Gentile, the dogs, would be evildoers, outsiders, okay? And so they would have this way, like, yeah, I can love my Jewish neighbor. I can love my wife. I can love most of you, right? Notice I said most of you. No, I can love all of you. But Jesus is explaining the true intent and the extent of our love for our neighbor. In Proverbs, and I think again it says it in one of Paul's epistles, it talks about how we're to be kind to our enemies. It's like heaping coals on their head. Some people say, yeah, get them, burn their head. No, it's not a bad thing. It's something good. It's even an Old Testament teaching that we're to be kind to our neighbors or to our enemies. And Jesus contradicts this popular teaching in a most radical way. Let's look at that. We're to love our enemies. That's pretty important. How many here are married to somebody or have been married? You ever feel like your spouse was your enemy? Have you ever said like, oh God, you don't know what this person's doing to me. You don't know how wrong they are, and the conviction to love them. But even our enemies we're to love. So even if at the worst case, we've seen marriages, on the brink, and we tell people that, but even if they're your enemy, you still have to love them. We don't escape that responsibility. And so Jesus says, we're not to hate our enemies. We're to love our enemies. We're to bless those who curse us. We're to do good to those who hate us. Have you ever done that? Have you ever really done this? At work, I find myself with opportunities to do that with people who I don't get along with or who for some reason don't like me. That's really hard to imagine, but it happens. And when you're kind to them, it's like they're disarmed. They don't know how to deal with that, and they can't figure it out. And the reason this is so important is because, you know what? I've said this before. We're not here for our happiness, okay? We're not here to build our kingdom. If being saved was the prime directive and objective of God's plan for us, which it is in a way, and it is, but he would have raptured us at the moment of our regeneration, at the moment that we were justified, but he didn't. He left us here for a reason. The reason is to get other people to come with us, to be an example and a witness to the world. Paul says in Philippians, I don't think we're going to cover that particular verse, but he says the things that have happened to him, the bad things, were for the furtherance of the gospel. That's our life. Everything that happens to us, if we can look at that and we can realize that, no matter how bad this is, it's for the furtherance of the gospel if I'm in God's will. And that's the only reason I'm here. That's my objective. That's my goal in life, is to bring glory to God and to exalt his name on the earth and to bring other people to him. Then we start to see how important this is, because a lot of times the only way someone's going to listen to what you have to say is they're going to have to see you're genuine. Again, like with my advisor, I can say I love you to them. Probably doesn't mean a thing, especially if they see me acting another way. But if I'm actually loving them, in spite of their actions or reactions to me, then that goes a long way. It says, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Now, that's a little dangerous these days because people get upset when you pray for them now for some reason. I know there was a thing on Twitter, I guess, where they were saying, we can't pray for, these people. We have to actually do something, and they misunderstand the whole point of prayer because these people don't have a biblical worldview. They don't understand that, God created this world, the all-powerful, all-eternal, all-knowing, unchanging, holy, immanent, transcendent God who created everything. He loves us and he honors our free will. Okay, and somehow he works that together. He works that together to get his will done. So how important is it that we recognize that and that we're okay with what God does for us? And not only that, to appreciate it to the point where we are able to be examples to other people. He goes on in verse 45 that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good. God does that. God blesses those that don't believe in him, those that don't worship him. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. Turn to Romans 5. I want to keep you guys awake. I have a tendency to put people to sleep, so Romans 5. Verse 6 through 11. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous person, for a righteous man will one die. Yet perhaps for a good man, someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us, and that while we were still sinners, we were his enemies, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation. God gives us an example of loving our enemies. When Christ died for each of us, I remember what I was like before I acknowledged, the reality of Christ dying on the cross and asking, to receive that forgiveness, surrendering basically. And I think of the person who I was, the people that I hurt, the people that I lied to, the people that I took advantage of. And not everybody has that testimony. I'm not proud of it, but it gives me some depth to know, just the depths and the lengths that God would go to save a person. I know some people who raised in good families, go to church. Nephew of Ruby's, real good kid, just always never been in trouble and never had to go through that. We don't, because God loves us. We don't. But for some of us, we have to go through that, because then that puts us in a position or a place where we grope for him, where we, he shows us our need for him. Turn to John chapter 14. So we've looked at, that we're to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We're to love our neighbors. We're even to love our enemies. John 14, verse 15. And he says, "If you love me, keep my commandments. And I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may abide with you forever. The Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. I will not leave you orphans. I will come to you. A little while longer, and the world will see me no more. But you will see me, because I live. You will live also. At that day you will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you." You see that intimacy that we can have? When God was, before he created anything, he already existed in a loving relationship within the persons of the Trinity. He didn't need us. He was already relational. And now he gives us the opportunity to be a part of that. Again, that creator of the universe, that person that created everything that you see, wanted to have a loving relationship with us. He says, "If you love me, keep my commandments. And if we do that, I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper," the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth. In verse 18, he says something interesting. He says, "I will not leave you orphans. I will come to you." Makes me think that when it's this almost mystical way that through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit that happened eventually to them and that we have as believers, Jesus is with us. But I think there's a trigger to that, to really experience that intimacy. I think we have to be people who love. I think that we have to be people who love one another. Being created in the image of God, and I've said this before, I truly believe that we most reflect the image of God when we're loving others. Okay? And so when in verse 21, where he says, "He who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." So I see here that, there's this special thing going on, and it's triggered by this love. Go down to, or actually go back to John 13. So if we love him, we keep his commandments. And what are the commandments? Basically, I always think of those two, love God and love your neighbor, right? And if you've done that, you're pretty much okay. And so Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And there's other things, but that kind of encompasses the whole thing, the whole enchilada, as Pastor John says. John 13:34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. Okay? So he's building on that. It's not just to love one another, but it's to love one another as Jesus loved us. I don't see any place where Jesus said, I love you, but they all knew he loved them. In John 13, it says he loved them till the end, right? He says, by this, all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So in John 13, he had just demonstrated to them by service. He washed their feet, and he gave them an example of kind of how to love each other, how to serve. And you got to remember that Judas had departed by the time he said this, but Judas was part of that. It's really interesting. If you look at the way that they were seated, some people say it was a triclinium. Basically that's kind of like tables set like this. And you can actually go and you can point out like who was which guest. And if you look at the way it's described, Judas was actually the guest of honor at that dinner, and Jesus served him. So, Jesus even loved him. And it's interesting because I don't think Jesus thought of him as an enemy. And I think there's something to that as well, that when we have enemies, it probably should be because people consider us their enemies, in most cases. I don't think that we should be people who actually have enemies, at least not, from our perspective, because we're to love these people. And it's really hard to love people if you kind of think of them as your enemies. But that's me. That's just my thought. Turn to John 15. And this is the chapter about biting in the vine. Excuse me. And Jesus repeats what he just said above. And in John 15:12, he says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. But he expands on it. He says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. Now, in Jesus' case, in the case of Jesus, he literally laid down his life. And I think, there probably is something to that we should be willing to lay down our lives if necessary. Because the whole scripture is about not loving your life, right? Here on earth. Not loving our existence here. This isn't our home. When we get finally over to Philippians tonight, we're not going to cover this, but Paul tells them that their citizenship is in heaven. Okay? And one of the reasons I think he does that is because Philippi was this Roman colony. And when you look at Acts 16, and you look and you see who we affectionately refer to as Python Pam, the girl who had the spirit of the python, and he rebukes her and he casts it out of her. And he gets in trouble with the people there because they're saying that, this is a Jewish person doing these things that are unlawful for Romans to do and say and this and that. And so you get a hint of this, him butting his heads up against this nationalistic pride maybe, because, hey, if you live in that time, I guess it'd be a big deal to be a Roman, right? Paul used that a couple of times and get people in trouble because, they beat him and he was a Roman. They didn't know it. But the people around them would look at that as something that they could say differentiated them and use it against them. So they would have this pressure not to acquiesce to what everybody else was doing. And, as our nation grows increasingly secular, I think we can kind of take from that too. Because Paul told them, he says, conduct yourselves worthy. He's actually saying, be a good citizen. And so their citizenship, he's giving them a hint that your citizenship is in heaven. This really isn't your home. And he says in other places that they're sojourners, we're pilgrims. And if we can kind of keep that in the forefront of our minds, that this isn't our home, I think it frees us up to maybe be more loving and to really kind of delve into what Jesus is saying. He says in 35, but by this all will know. Oh, wait a second, we're down to 15, sorry. So this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. No longer, verse 15, do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things I heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. These things I command you, that you love one another. So he's really hitting that, loving one another. And he talks about us being his friends. In the Old Testament, it was Moses and Abraham. They were obedient. And he's telling them that you are my friends in verse 14 if you do whatever I command you, right? His yoke is easy, his burden is light. All he's telling us to do is to love God. Does God deserve our love? Yeah, he does. Do I remember to love him all the time? No, because I'm a cretin, I'm just too fleshy. But God deserves our love. And then he tells us to love others. Interesting thing about this is that he says here in verse 16 that you should go and bear fruit, that your fruit should remain. I was looking at what MacArthur had to say about this. I don't go to MacArthur a lot, but I liked what he said. There's three basic reference of fruit in the New Testament: love, praise, the fruit of our lips, and converts. Paul talked about that, I think, in Romans 1 chapter. And he's talking about fruit. And we also know the fruit of the Spirit is love, right? So it's kind of weird to me that all this is kind of related. As we love God and then we obey his commandment is to love others, even to love our enemies as well as our neighbors. Kind of like when in one of the Gospels where Jesus asked, the guy, what do you think, is the greatest commandment? And he quoted it, and then he said, but he tried to get cute and say, but who's my neighbor? And then he told him about the Good Samaritan, right? Everybody is our neighbor. But what kind of floats around in my head, and I'm sorry because it's pretty loose up there, is that this all kind of self-encompassing. You can't get away from this love thing. You really can't. Because even if you want to be legalistic, well, you're going to be loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And it's kind of hard to be legalistic when you're doing that, because love is not about compulsion. It's not about, it's about liberty. That's one of the things we see in the New Testament when they talk about false teachers, false doctrines. They always lead to bondage. They always lead to works. They always lead to trying to promote the teacher. But love is freeing. It's liberating. I remember when I first got saved, which was a long time ago, You remember being in that Christian bubble where nothing really fazed you? It's like, oh, you're just kind of walking around. People could say things to you that were like really mean or really meant to put pressure on you. And you're just, okay, There's something about our perspective. When we can let go of this and think about that. I remember people told me I was too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. That's insane. You can't be too heavenly minded. Set your minds on the things above, not on the things on the earth beneath. We're to be focused on there because, that's reality. Francis Chan does this wonderful thing where he gets a rope and he gets this whole long rope, like yards and yards and yards. And he puts a little tape on there and he says, you know what? This rope is time. And this little tiny piece of tape is your life. And how many people live for that little piece of tape that's going to blow away? It's going to be over. If you think about it, time exists within eternity, and God's at both ends of that, roughly speaking. There's no way for me to say that in a proper way. And then within the timeline, the material existence or the start of the universe till, he creates everything new, we're like this. We're this tiny little speck. Most of it's going to be in heaven. And so it behooves us to try to let go a little bit, I think. And I'm speaking to me too because I don't like to let go. I don't like ambiguity at all. I like knowing where my paycheck comes from. I like knowing that I'm going to eat breakfast in the morning, I'm going to have lunch, and I'm going to have dinner. I like all of that stuff. I like planning. I like everything to be neat and in little packets. But God's been challenging me about that lately. Turn to 1 John. Now, I don't know any Greek. I've taken a few Bible courses, but, so every now and then I might throw out a Greek word just to, whatever. I really don't know what I'm talking about, so forgive me. But in 1 John chapter 3:16, he says, by this we know. I'm told that that's the word gnosko, which means to get to know something or somebody intimately, to experiential kind of knowledge. He says, by this we know, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That word ought, it means something you should do. And it's not just dying for each other. I think dying is probably simple. If I saw a car come in that was going to hit Sean and I didn't have a chance to think about it, I might jump in front of the car because I didn't have time to think about it. But Sean needs to borrow my table saw. Well, I really like my table saw. Let me think about this. It's a lot harder sometimes when you have time to think about things and you're intentional about your love and how we love people. But John says we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods, okay, and that's kind of a weird translation there because I was looking at that, but I'm not going to get into it, but it kind of talks about life. Whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue. I love you too. But in deed and in truth. I find it very interesting that he says that whoever has this world's goods sees his brother in needs and shuts up his heart. Because I think sometimes I can do a good thing and still be shutting up my heart because people are watching maybe, or it's expected, or I'm getting frustrated about it. And so I think there has to be this parallelism between, or this correspondence, let's say, between what's going on in our heart and what we're doing with our stuff. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? Verse 19, and by this we know that we are of the truth. Well, I think he's referring back to the couple of verses up. When we lay down our lives, when we live for others, and shall assure our hearts before him. For if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart and knows all things. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence towards God. And whatever we ask, we receive from him. So there's something about our prayers even that are kind of affected by this and our confidence before God. Because sometimes we may be thinking, I'm not right. Because our heart's kind of deceitful, right, Jeremiah? And emotions are kind of deceitful. But if we know that we're acting in love and we're, laying down our lives for others and we're doing what we should be doing, then we can kind of have confidence that we're probably on the right track. He says here, and whatever we ask, I said, receive from him because we keep his commandments. So there's something to do with obeying and aligning our wills with God's will, because there are people that teach that you can ask anything and you'll get it. Well, it has to be according to his will, right? We know that. And if we're loving him and we're obeying his commandments and we're loving others, good chance that we're kind of in the middle of his will, I think. Verse 23. Oh, and this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. Now he who keeps his commandments abides in him, and he in him. And by this we know that he abides in us by the Spirit whom he has given us. So we know God's love by his actions. Jesus laid down his life. And I think we should express our love by our actions as well. And I think that's what he's saying. Laying down our lives for others. Turn to James. Chapter 2. You probably know where I'm going. Verse 14. And I'm going to read this little section here, 14 through 26. It said, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? When you read this stuff and you start trying to take it seriously, it's really challenging because sometimes you run up against like your fears or like the practical things that you think you should do, and then you try to compare that to Scripture, and like I find myself going like, well, I should be offering this. I have this. I have this. This person needs it. And I'm right now I'm talking more or less within the body or the family or people we had a thing last year. We did this thing with this person we didn't know very well, and that kind of was really weird. That's a different sermon topic, but it was a step of faith, to step out, and we gave somebody, let them stay in our house for a couple months, and We had no idea who they were, and we got to know them. It was interesting. But it was almost like I was sitting there, and I was thinking, I have this room, and this person needs a room, and they're sleeping in their car. And I said, okay, Lord, I'm not going to say anything because this is a young lady. So if you want something to happen, you're going to have to speak to my wife. And so the next day we were praying on a Thursday night, and my wife got to talking to her, and she said, come live with us for a little bit, It was really weird because, my wife would never do that. But I think that the prompting of the Lord was so strong, because I think he spoke to me first, but I didn't push it at all. I didn't say anything. And it worked out okay, but it was probably one of those dangerous things. It really kind of pushed both of us to the limit a little bit. So, when we do these things, like James says here, you see somebody, I see homeless people every day. I can't give out dollars to every single one of them, because they start crowding you. And one lady, she says, I can't use $1. I need $4, I say, I only got $1. Forget it. And she walked away, took my $1. But she was like really mad at me, So it's crazy. Anyway, verse 16. And one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and be filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body. What does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac, his son, on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. Just like Jesus said, we're his friends. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Okay? Now, we don't teach that you have to do works to earn your salvation. That's not what he's saying. But it's interesting that what you believe, what you really think is true, is going to flesh itself out of your life. Somehow it's going to come out. You're going to reveal what you really believe. And so Paul, James is saying, if you have faith, there's going to be some fruit. There's going to be some evidence of it. Kind of like the authenticity of our salvation. Turn back to Philippians. After that long introduction, let's get to Philippians and let's start our study now. And I will be done quickly. But I want to point out a couple of things. Remember in Philippians, Paul gives these examples of people that have put others ahead of themselves. And he sees that there's something brewing there. He's afraid that the things that have happened in other churches, like the Judaizers, the false teachers, could possibly be coming there. And he also sees the seeds of dissension starting to manifest themselves amongst two women especially. Now, I'm not picking on women or anything, it's just that Euodia and Syntyche, apparently they're leaders in the church, and they're having issues. And so Paul goes to all this trouble to write this, and he gives these examples of Jesus, being humbled to the point of death, and Timothy and Epaphroditus, loving them even to the point of almost dying when he went to go minister to Paul, and then being more worried about how they felt about him almost dying than he was about dying. So Paul gives this letter, and he talks about this in verses 8 and 9. He says, "For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more." And so he breaks this down a little bit. And so Paul, well, what do you mean by that? How should their love abound still more and more? He wants their love to continue. Remember in Ephesus, they got in the book of Revelation, they had lost their first love. Paul doesn't want that to happen to these people. And so he tells them, in knowledge and all discernment. Love, again, isn't just saying, I love you too. Or I like to tell people, say, "Oh, I love you too," and they kind of give you the, thing, and they walk away. What he's talking about, knowledge and discernment, is basically moral perception and insight. It's being selective and intentional about how we love people. I know my wife, and when we first got married, I tried to buy her gifts, and I've shared this before, so if you've heard it, I apologize. She hated everything I got her, okay? And then I learned to ask my daughters, what did mom look at in the store? And she was, oh, she did this, whatever. And I think she probably told them, well, if your dad asked you, tell him this, because I have no taste, right? And so that worked out for a few years, and then they grew up and they left. And so I can't really buy her gifts because for some reason my knowledge and my discernment don't work in that area. I mean, I got her. I've tried really hard to get her things that she just hates. Remember those pearls, hon? She hated these pearls. Oh, they make me look like an old woman. I loved them. They were great. They were awesome. And she said, no, I don't want to wear these. So now she buys her own gift. And it's just like being back with the kids, when they want to buy you your gift and you give them the money. It's kind of like that. So, but love, it takes a knowledge, an insight. And I believe this comes from the Holy Spirit a little bit. Well, not a little bit, a lot, right? The fruit of the Spirit. But it also comes with surrendering to the Lord. As we surrender to Him, He enables our thinking. We're transformed by the renewing of our mind. We're to have the mind of Christ. He even says that in Philippians. He says, let this mind be in you also, which was in Christ Jesus, who humbled himself to the point of death, even death on the cross. So we're to think like Jesus. We're to think in a loving way. How can I love this person? Because I remember another quick little story. My oldest daughter had this thing that was growing on her leg. It was causing her a lot of pain. And we went to the emergency room, and they were going to lance it, which would have been the right thing to do because they would have let the pus out and everything. It would have healed. They would have given her antibiotics. But she was crying so much that I said, no, we're just going to put hot compresses on it. We're going to go home. And eventually it went away. It did. But I remember how bad I felt because the right thing to do would have been the loving thing, even though it would have hurt or would have been more, she probably would have said, if you love me, kids are, we have adults like that too. But, to love people, we have to have a moral perception and insight of what would really be loving in this particular instance for this particular person. Because it probably wasn't a good thing. That could have gotten infected. Worse, it could have been a big deal, and that would have been my fault. So, when we love people, it's not just saying I love you. It's not just warm and fuzzies. It's not just, they used to say sloppy agape. It's not that. It's intentional. It's how can I make this person's life better? It's like being Magic Johnson. You go out on that court, you find the right guy, you pass the ball to him, they score a bucket. You didn't get the bucket, but the team was better. That's kind of like that. That you may approve the things that are excellent. Scrutinizing between things, actually looking and thinking and picking out the things that are actually good and bad. Not just, oh, it sounds good. No, it's thought, it's intention. And remember I said to love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and your mind? When we love each other, remember in 1 John it says, how can you love God whom you can't see if you can't love your brother, or if you hate him who you can see? I'm practice for you guys. You guys practice loving me who you can see so that you can love God better. Okay? So we love each other, we're practicing, and we're learning to love better, and we're making good decisions, and we're loving with our minds, and we love God with our minds too. He goes on and he says, that you may be sincere without offense till the day of Christ. Love needs to have integrity. It needs to be sincere. Now, whenever we see the word sincere, people tend to say, well, that means without wax. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I hear it a lot. The way it's supposed to go is sincere is like sincera, without wax. And what they would do is supposedly take the sculptures or the vases that they would take out and try to sell. And if they had a blemish or a hole, they would put wax in the hole and cover it up. And so what you would do if you were a buyer, you'd hold it up to the light and try to see if the light came through. If the light came through, the light would reveal the blemish, kind of like the truth of God revealing what's really happening in the universe and in our day. And what would happen is if you didn't do that, you take your statue out with the waxy nose that they covered, and the sun gets hot and it melts. The wax falls off, or you pour something in the bowl or the pitcher and it drips out because it had wax. It wasn't sincere. It wasn't something that was inspected by the light. So our love is to be sincere and without offense to the day of Christ, without wax, integrity. Being filled with the fruits of righteousness. I read one commentator that said that should actually, a better translation would be being filled with the fruit that righteousness produces. I like that. Again, I don't read Greek, so I'm going to go with that. Doc, you can tell me later. But being filled with the fruit righteousness produces, which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Love, our love is to be fruitful. And again, like I said earlier, our ultimate purpose is to bring glory and praise to God. Why else are we here? Why didn't he take us home? We're here because we have works to do. He's created these, we're his masterpiece, and he's given us these masterpieces that we're supposed to create and be a part of as well. He's given us the honor and the privilege to be co-participating with him as he's saving people. And so, that's what Paul wants them to get their heads wrapped around. Like CCFM, the Philippians were a loving church filled with joy. Again, like I said, he had mostly praise and thanksgiving for them. But there were potential challenges that he wanted them to avoid. And I think there are challenges we need to avoid as well. Legalism, disunity. I've had people, criticize me because I buy coffee at Starbucks. It's like, okay. And I personally, I hate Disneyland with a passion, but I will never tell you cannot go to Disneyland. And I have my reasons. But little things like that can bust up a church. if you guys get a chance later on, it's only 4 chapters. You can read it. And you'll see how he hones in on these 2 particular people, Euodia and Syntyche. And it was so important to Paul, the unity of the church, understanding how important love is. When he talks about how Jesus died for them, that he emptied himself of everything. The kenosis, we empty ourselves. Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope that was informative. We don't have a closing worship song. Tomorrow, you want to come up and do a song? No? Okay. Let's pray.